Welcome, Julian.
Thank you,
Tell us
Nikki.
a little bit about Hold and what your focus is in terms of Israeli property.
Thanks, Nikki. So a little bit about the history of the company. I made Aliyah from South Africa 9 years ago and essentially joined Hold Real Estate, which has been in real estate in Israel since the early 1970s. The founder then made Aliyah to Israel. And essentially we have one purpose, and that's focusing on assisting foreign investors purchase residential real estate in Israel. That's what we do, that's what we focus on, and that's what we've been doing, for the last 30, 40 odd years.
Okay, great. In your professional opinion, can you give us an overview of the landscape of the market at the moment?
Yeah, sure. Just before I do that, Nikki, I just want to just cover very briefly, the services that we provide to our international buyers. I think I want to cover as much as what we try and do is cover as much as we can and disclose as much as we know about purchasing residential real estate in Israel from abroad. So what that means, and I'm breaking it down to four parts. So the first one is the commercial aspect of the transaction. And these are all the services that we provide. So we assist with opening up bank accounts, which can be done remotely. We help with transferring money into Israel using various platforms. We assist with mortgage applications. We'll cover that a bit later. That foreigners are able to apply and receive mortgages, obviously based on bank approval, but we assist with that. And then we also have mortgage advisors on the team that would assist in advising the best route to take coming when it comes to mortgages. Very importantly as well, in order to purchase property in Israel, the buyer needs legal representation here in Israel, so we assist with that. Of course, any lawyer that we recommend or work with is completely independent of us, so they represent the buyers in this transaction. We also have tax advisors on the team, different tax structures. We can offer, not we don't offer the advice, but our tax advisors who are also independent of us would offer that advice. And then a very important part of our offering is the operational. We're going to suggest the best way to get involved in property, and I thank Lior for being here on the call. He's going to cover a little bit later of buying residential real estate in projects. But what that means is that there's quite a lot of language differences and cultural differences in getting the apartment delivered. So we oversee that process as well, which means liaising with the various developers, with the suppliers of the finishes, the tiling, the kitchens. We have a team that manages all that through our architectural services, our interior decorating services as well. We have an engineering team as well that assists with the project management, although of course the developer has that, but we oversee it on behalf of our buyers. So we have that. Very importantly are the pre-delivery inspections. So we go into the apartment before delivery, do very detailed inspections, and that's very, very important. And we'll cover it a little bit later because everything you buy from a developer here in Israel by law is protected for at least 1 year. So we oversee that process as well. And then a very substantial post-sales management where we would help with the management of the apartment, any maintenance, finding tenants, collecting rentals. So that's part of what we do. So that's just about the services that we provide. Just a little bit about the residential, to answer your question, Nikki, residential real estate in Israel. So since 2008, we've seen more demand for property in Israel than there's been supply. And what that means, it's led to long-term price growth. So we've seen prices since 2008 in general have been going up.
Great.
So
So
let me
you're
just, sorry,
still
Nikki, I
busy.
just got disconnected there. Let me just come back to that. Sorry about that. Um, sorry about that. So we've seen growth. We've seen a shortage of accommodation. So there's been more demand than supply. We've seen a population that's growing, has grown and continues to grow, 2% annually, which is creating more of that change in the supply and demand curve. There's limited land in Israel, higher immigration levels we've seen lately, and there's also been quite strong employment in tech and the services industry. So all this is really just making the demand for property more and more. Since 2003, for reasons we all know, there's been an increase in the supply and a slowdown in the demand. So basically, what's happened is because of the high interest rate that we experienced since 2023 and the war, there has been some moderation in prices in certain areas in Israel. Few apartments since 2003 wasn't a bad year, but 2004 and 2005, particularly 2005, there were far fewer apartments sold in Israel. But what that's led to, and I'm sure Aliyah will touch on it a bit later, is that some developers are now making really smart offers where we can structure better deals for investors. Just to cover a little bit on the rental demand. So the rental demand is really strong in Israel because of the pricing. Most young people have to work and save money until their 30s before they can purchase apartments in Israel. And that basically covers, the landscape, Nikki, more supply than demand. There's been a slowdown, but this is just to benefit of the buyers as we see it.
Absolutely. I think many buyers are very concerned, especially when it comes to buying a property in a foreign country, about the risk. Can you just give us a sense of how a buyer is protected in Israel when it comes to purchasing real estate?
Yeah. I think, Dickie, that's been governed by law now. I mean, there were some horror stories, from 20, 30 years ago. But basically, two very important things. One is that by law in Israel, when you buy a property from the developers that we recommend, that you're issued with a bank guarantee. So the money doesn't get paid to the developer. The developer has to have a financing bank, and I'm going to touch on it a bit later, of the pre-sale process, and maybe Lior will as well. But basically, money transfers not to the developer, it goes to the financing bank who issue with a bank guarantee. So your money is not at risk in this process. Also, as I mentioned earlier, very important to have an independent lawyer who represents the buyers here in Israel. And also, one of the risks people say, what happens if something happens to the developer? Unfortunately, we saw a war. But basically, when a contract is signed for the purchase of an apartment in a project in Israel, there's a contractual delivery date. When the developer, and if the developer is late and it exceeds that delivery date, then the developer starts paying the investor market-related rental as compensation.
Right. That definitely helps in terms of fear that people have.
Definitely, and it should give a lot of comfort because governed by law, I mean, there's
Yeah,
no better way to
especially
do
the
it.
law in Israel. People definitely abide by that. So
Yeah.
let's talk about financing. When it comes to new developments as opposed to buying something existing, what would you recommend and how does it work?
So Nikki, just so you know, we recommend buying in projects. I'll touch on it a bit later why, but basically, the typically to buy an apartment in Israel, the purchaser needs to put down 20%, pay the first 20% of the purchase price. Now, in order to get, I mentioned those financing bank, in order to get a financing bank to support a project or to finance a project, the developer has a pre-sale period where what they do is they offer very good terms and very good pricing. Because once they've got the bank financing, then they can actually kick off the project. So 20% typically, it's now been reduced slightly, but typically it's 20% in order to secure it. I mentioned a bit earlier that now what some developers are offering is they're offering projects where they offer interest subsidized payment plans. In other words, instead of 20% in some of our projects, you can put down 10%. The developer through the banking system here offers financing interest paid by the developer. So, that's one of the offers that are currently in Israel. But financing banks in Israel will typically loan foreigners 50% of the purchase price once 50% has been paid. So that's one way of financing it. And just to cover, Nick, when in a project, if you put down 10 or 20% now, and let's say the project's delivered in 3 or 4 years' time, that's all that's required. I know Mark mentioned it a bit earlier. You have got the exchange rate exposure, but you can basically now purchase and own an apartment in Israel with 10, 20% payable now with bank guarantees. Just from a financing point of view as well, as the rental market is very good. So what we try and do is offer advice where to ensure that when you buy an apartment and put a tenant into it, that rental income covers, if not all, but a lot of that those mortgage repayments.
Julian, just in terms of rental yields, there was a question about that. Can you just touch on that?
Yeah, it's typically between 2.5% to 3.5%. So those are yields, but most people would invest in real estate in Israel because of the capital appreciation that we've experienced over the last few years, mainly because of that supply and demand curve.
Okay, great. Let's talk hidden costs when it comes to purchasing, because the purchase price is just one figure. What should people be aware of?
Okay, great. Here, one thing that we do, at Hold is we try and disclose and be completely transparent on all the costs that we know are involved in the purchase. We don't want any hidden surprises later on. The first is just to cover purchase tax. I suppose that's the most significant one besides the purchase price. But there's typically 8%. That's the standard in purchasing apartment, 8% of the purchase price. That does scale up for transactions as the price scales up. So there is some benefit to Olim. So people making Aliyah coming to live in Israel, that purchase price is reduced according to the scale. And also for Israeli citizen first-time buyers living in Israel, tax resident in Israel, there's some benefit as well, also on a sliding scale. So we have basically, by rule of thumb, an 8% purchase tax. There's also an exposure to the building index. And what that is, that's a government published index. It's published monthly. And what that does is it tracks inflation in both materials and labor. And any amount that's outstanding, that index is applicable. So let's just assume you buy a property for 100, you've paid 50, that balance of the 50 then is linked to that building index. But what we try and do is estimate what it could be based on history and apply a number to that, although that is a variable. Then obviously you've got your lawyer's fees. So a lawyer typically charges a percentage of the transaction. There's the real estate agent fees. I mentioned the building index. There's a fee. The mortgage advisor would typically charge a fee. And then what we do is based on our knowledge of receiving an apartment, there are some miscellaneous costs. We estimate what those are as well. But there's things like you need to connect the apartment when you receive it to water, electricity, gas, perhaps some upgrades into the apartment, depends on the purpose. So we disclose all those. We put together a very detailed cash flow. So all the costs are covered when you receive a cash flow.
In terms of managing a property from abroad, is that doable for someone buying overseas? How does that work?
So very much, and again, I think I mentioned earlier, but we have a department that manages the property for people living overseas. So we take care of everything, literally finding the tenant, the legal side of finding a tenant, collecting the rentals, and a call center where any issues with the apartment, we deal with that immediately and feedback to investors to the level that they want feedback.
Now, Hold we sort of niche our market to new developments, and there are a couple of reasons for that. And I know that we select developments in our portfolio quite carefully. Can you take us through the main thinking process and selection process that you go through, that our team goes through, and what people should be looking for in a good purchase or a good investment in a new development?
Sure. So I think, Nikki, first and foremost, although you do get bank guarantee, buyers do get bank guarantees for the money, is to ensure that, we're dealing or that you're buying from reputable investors. We have Leo, and one of the developers he represents is Africa Israel, where we've done a number of developments or sold in a number of their developments very successfully. So we deal with the larger developers here in Israel. Just from a buying in a project, I think I mentioned it earlier, but the cash flow is very important, that you don't need to come up with all the money. So that's one of the things to consider, as opposed to buying something that's ready, where you'd need to come up with at least 50% of the money now. New areas. So we have a team that does research into new areas. What we've done is we've tracked the mass transport systems around Israel. I'll come into that. Basically, buying into projects as well, you get the latest technology. It's typically in a new area, so you get the benefit of that. And historically, there's been very good capital appreciation in buying in the areas that we recommend. Where to buy? So there's areas in Israel where they do what's called Tama 38, which is an urban renewal project where they take older buildings in Israel, typically 3 stories in old areas. They do 2 things. Either they demolish them, replace them with larger buildings, more floors. So that's the one kind of project. The other one is where they just reinforce the building and add some more floors. So that's quite an interesting angle. We look at the army bases. Army bases are moving up north and south. So in the area where there's army bases as well, Serona Market, as an example, was an army base, become very, very sought after that area. As I mentioned, we're looking at the light rail, the mass transport system. So anything with access to that, because especially if you're going to be putting a tenant into it, at least they can then commute around the country easily. Tel Aviv and the surrounds, it's become very popular as well with international investors. Jerusalem, for very, very obvious reasons. The Tanya Renana, mainly because of the communities. A lot of the discussions we've been having in Australia have been around Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Renana, and Netanya, and mainly because of the Anglo communities. And the south of Israel is also becoming very, very interesting.